As somebody neurodivergent, I noticed early in my life, I tended to make a lot of generalizations. And I think it's probably because of autistic tendencies to want to infer information or ADHD jumping to conclusions. But I would look at something, gather some intel, and then make a deduction based on that often limited information that I perceived to be factual, often if it was just empirical, i.e. my own perception of a situation or collected experiences that I've had of the same or similar situation. And I would go with that. I'd create a hypothesis and I would go with that. And I think that's pretty conventional for people to do it. However, I was unable to perceive that my experiences were quite limited and also shaped by my experience as somebody neurodivergent at the time, undiagnosed. So I had a very skewed perception of how things were, how people were, how society was, how human interactions worked. And I know that when I voiced those generalizations, people would just look at me like, what are you talking about? Or they would tell me it was a generalization. And I think the underlying expression here was that it was stereotyping, for example, or it was inaccurate. It was based on a very limited scope of experience, which in hindsight I can recognize post-diagnosis, and now having had, a couple of years behind me as an adult, I have a wider set of experiences and I can look back and think that, oh, well, that was a generalization. But when I interact with younger people who are neurodivergent and I have multiple instances had that person say something that's really generalized, I've usually called it because I'm like, hey, by the way, that's a generalization. That might be true of your experience, but it's not necessarily true of other people's experiences. And then I've been reminded of that challenge. And I think the desire to make these quick deductions is often motivated by a desire to make sense of the world. We want to understand it, so we reduce it to black and white concepts, binary thinking. And obviously that's reductive, so therefore it can lead to a lot of logical errors or fallacies. And it's hard to know that you're experiencing a logical error or fallacy if your scope and your experience is limited, and if you haven't developed the critical thinking skills to actually step out and then make a broader analysis of what you've said, and also to consider, other factors that could be shaping your experience or what you've perceived. And the generalizations can often be red flags to other people when you make them, because you come across to the other person, often neurotypicals, as being prejudiced, biased, misinformed, naive even, because you're making deductions based on limited experience. And also that can be shaped by your negative experiences, which many neurodivergents have growing up in an ableist world. For example, all people are untrustworthy. You might have had multiple experiences of people proving untrustworthy and not, in the case of neurotypicals, doing what they say. And that's a thing. There's this constant disparity between what neurotypicals say and what they actually do. So the prevailing impression by neurodivergence is that people are inherently trustworthy. That's the deduction we arrive at. A more nuanced explanation is that many people socially front and say one thing and do another to maintain social appearances, to engage in social grooming, to appease other people, to respect the social hierarchy, but it doesn't necessarily mean what they say. It could mean something symbolic. It could mean just, an expression or a gesture that's necessary for the social grooming process, but they might say something and not actually even mean it. Whereas for a neurodivergent, we like to be explicit, direct. We mean what we say. There's no double meaning. And so we see this disparity and we're like, why can't people be the same? It's like, well, all neurotypicals or all people are untrustworthy because they don't say what they mean or they don't do what they say. And then it's like, well, yeah, why would you want to trust them? And that little shortcut, that mental shortcut, is a way to avoid disappointment, harm. Like if we make these quick deductions, it's less cognitive effort, right? So there's a mental laziness component of it where it's like you're trying to, because we are what the term is called cognitive misers. We're all cognitive misers. We're very miserly with the cognitive effort we want to put into things. That's a universal human trait. And so we want to take those shortcuts. And also, if you are neurodivergent living in an ableist world, the world is pretty threatening. And the way to stay safe is to make quick deductions and draw quick conclusions and avoid danger, right? You see a snake on the road and or something that looks like a snake, and the immediate deduction, it's a snake. I'm going to jump back. It could be a piece of rope. It could be a stick. But your brain is going to make these evolutionarily primed responses to the perceived danger and then react. And that's where we get into trouble. When we use these mental shortcuts, when we use generalizations, we reduce the world to something that is manageable, understandable, but we have a false impression about that. And we perceive, for example, danger when there isn't danger. And this can kind of create, in social situations, a negative feedback loop where we perceive people as untrustworthy, we don't invest in them, and then we look for evidence to substantiate our generalization, to reinforce it. Oh, well, this person did this and this, therefore people aren't trustworthy. And there might be conflicting evidence that we refuse to take in, like because we have a confirmatory bias. We're looking for evidence to substantiate our pre-existing generalization, and then we can get very cognitively rigid and double down on our perception and not take into consideration other perceptions or conflicting ideas, and then we enter this echo chamber of our own thoughts, and we're not willing to consider other ideas, and we become very closed-minded, very guarded, very withdrawn, right? And it's a negative spiral, and it doesn't serve the person, and it leads often to behaviors that disconnect them from other people. Have you experienced this tendency to generalize? Have you made these mental shortcuts as a neurodivergent person to better survive our world? What has your experience been like? Or have you perceived it in other people? Have you seen this in other human beings, other neurodivergents? Have they engaged in the same behavior? And how has it served or hindered that person or hindered yourself? I would love to hear from you.